What's up, riders? My name's Chewy. Today we're checking out the linkage fork from Motion Ride. Let's check it out. Okay, riders, so we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into this new linkage fork from Motion Ride. This fork comes in a few different options. In 27.5 wheel, you can get 150, 160 or 170 millimeter travel options. And in 27 plus and 29er, which is what I've got on the front of my bike, you can choose the 140, the 150 or the 160 millimeter travel options. There's a couple of different sticker colors, but traditionally it's a black color fork with a few different color sticker options to maybe suit your bicycle or not. Now, the linkage fork. Why would I ride a linkage fork? Because it is, let's say it's an unusual looking fork. I definitely think this is not everyone's cup of tea when it comes to the aesthetics, but I think if we saw a few pro racers winning on this fork and we got used to looking at this style of linkage fork on the front of people's bikes, then a sort of a common mainstream telescopic fork to what we're used to will sort of start to become a little bit low spec looking. I was lucky enough to borrow one of these forks and ride it a few times before I pulled the trigger on actually buying one. And the one on the front of my bike now is one that I've purchased with my own money. This is not a paid review whatsoever. It is $1,750 US. Ouch. That is a lot of money for a different style of fork. And if you haven't tried one of these before, you're probably going to try and ride one first before pulling the trigger and actually spending that much money on this fork. Let me get in a few of the advantages of a linkage fork and what it's like to ride this thing on the trail. First of all, the car park setup doesn't give you an accurate representation to how this fork is going to feel on the trail. I'm very used to setting up my bike in the car park, giving it a few bounces, getting the spring balances and the compression and the rebound to about where I like it, because I'm used to riding conventional style bikes and forks. This is not a conventional style fork. If you pull the front brake and try and compress the fork, it does not compress. If you jump on it in the car park and lean it forward and bounce it, it feels too soft. So the best way to dial its fork in is definitely on the trail. Don't bother car park testing this fork and trying to dial it in the car park. That doesn't work. On the trail, when you first ride it, you'll notice it feels quite stiff, as in the chassis feels quite stiff. I was expecting this thing to be a wobbling old pudding of a fork because of all the linkages in it. There's up to 10 pivot points, I think, on this fork. When you brake into a corner, the fork doesn't dive under braking. A conventional telescopic fork, they dive quite a lot. And normally what I do to combat that dive is run quite a bit of low speed compression. That will stop a conventional fork from diving. And I even tend to run the spring rate a little bit extra firm to also combat that diving. Now, that diving is definitely not a desirable feel. When you jump on this linkage fork from Motion Ride, the first thing you're going to notice is how flat the bike sits when you pull the brakes on and jump into a corner. Now, this is a huge advantage, let me tell you. It almost is so apparent, you actually really have to sort of adjust your riding style. So it does take a little while to get the full effect and the full benefit from this fork, because you're used to leaning back when you brake into a corner to stop that dive, and this thing sits so flat you don't have to lean back at all. You can keep that aggressive attack position and actually pull the brakes on really hard and then jump into a corner. The second point is when you're coming down steep descents that you have to apply the brakes. So long steep descents where you've got roots and rocks and bumps in your way, you pull the brake, it doesn't dive, and it actually helps the rear end bite, so the rear tire bites and the front end stays nice and high. This is the number one thing that immediately sold me on this fork. First trail, first ride, dropped into a steep descent, pulled the brakes on, and it was like it wasn't even steep. Steep sections that I would pucker up on and really like be almost afraid of, this fork holds the bike up, the front end sits nice and high, you pull the brakes, the back end grips because the front's not diving, and then because the front's not diving, you've got all of your suspension travel to soak up all the bumps. So I'm riding down these steep sections, pulling my brakes on, the roots are just getting absorbed, the rocks are just getting absorbed, and it absolutely transforms how you look at new trails. You see these steep trails, you pull your brakes on. It almost defies the rules of what you're used to in riding a bike. You're used to pulling your brakes on, the front diving in, you see a bump coming up, oh, you hit the bump, the front skids. There's none of that with this fork. The first steep trail I went down on this fork, I knew it was like checkmate. I've got to hand over $1,750 because I know myself, I will never be able to go back to a telescopic fork or a conventional style fork. It was literally checkmate. Shut up and take my money. I cannot go back to a normal style fork. Simple as that. Okay, so another huge advantage that I see with this fork that I haven't seen mentioned in other videos or reviews is the unsprung mass of this fork is incredibly light. Now they are able to achieve this by using carbon fiber lower legs and very nicely, precisely machined lower leg mounting hardware. Now there's no oil inside these lower legs, there's no valving or damping or spring, it's just the lower legs. They're completely empty carbon fiber structures with the mounting hardware on it, and that is it. So it has very low unsprung mass. Now you can absolutely feel this on the trail. It has an innate ability to hold the rider's speed through the chatter. You know when you're riding on a trail and it's not quite steep enough, but it's very rough, and the bike feels like it frustratingly wants to slow down because it's getting held up by the bumps. This fork is able to skip through that chatter like no other fork I have ridden. It's able to hold its speed very, very well. Now that is huge for a fork. It actually feels very, very nice in that fast chattery stuff. It does not get held up at all. It is also one of the huge advantages that I find with this style of fork. Another massive plus for this fork is the small bump compliance. Now the small bump compliance in this fork is phenomenal. It is probably the best performing fork for small bump grip that I've ever ridden. You're able to ride off cambers and slippery wet routes. It actually holds on very, very well. Now that is able to be achieved by not actually using the stanchions of a conventional type of fork, which get stiction from the seals and also stiction from the brass bushings that the stanchions slide up and down on. Now the linkages work very well to be able to reduce the amount of stiction in the fork, so that definitely translates to grip on the trail. It is fantastic for small bump grip. It is not all brilliance. There's a few little niggles in this fork that I will get to, but none of them are really deal breakers, but there are a few things that I can see that these guys can definitely improve on for the next iteration of this fork. I'm hoping they take this as constructive criticism, not a personal attack. Okay, the things that I don't like about this fork. Number one, in the leaf spring that they actually use a carbon fiber leaf spring as opposed to a conventional style coil spring. So I was running the preload on almost its firmest setting. Now I only weigh 70 kg without riding gear, and there's a lot of riders out there that are much heavier than me. So if you're a heavier rider, maybe 75 to 80 kg would be the maximum for this fork. I do like to run my fork and suspension a little bit stiffer than most probably would, but if you're a heavier rider, that may be a consideration as well. Maybe send them an email to see if they can offer a stiffer spring for you. My first main niggle is that this fork has a very slight inherent knock in the fork. Now I have had two of these forks, so I've been able to test them back to back to make sure that it wasn't a problem with one particular fork, and I've spoken to other people that own this fork as well, and they say the same thing. Every time the suspension changes direction, which is a lot, it has a very small knock. It's a very, very slight clunk. If you're like me and like your bike to be absolutely perfectly silent, then this is going to be a bit annoying, but it's definitely not a deal breaker. Now that knock, where it comes from is the actual linkage bushings in the spring mount. They're called IGUS, or IGUS bushings. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but those bushings have a little bit of stiction every time the suspension changes direction, and it creates a tiny little tick, 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 tick knock. I've reached out to Motion Ride and they said they're going to solve that problem by running needle roller bearings in their next iteration of the fork, or it might even be a running update to the fork. So that's good news. Hopefully that'll solve that little annoying knocking noise. Now their advice to me was to spray some WD-40 on the linkages. I don't really like that idea. I'd rather use a high-end bearing oil. So something that's very slippery. WD-40 isn't very slippery. I actually put some bike protectant spray in the linkages because that was all I had in the van. And because of its corrosion inhibiting properties, that bike protection spray actually turned that knocking noise into a horrible wailing noise. It sounded a bit like, you know, when you put a cheap saw through some thin plywood, it goes. All right, let's have a look at this clip of me riding in a small section, you can actually hear the fork approaching before I even hit this little jump. Check this out. So that annoying noise was from me spraying a corrosion inhibitor in the actual pivot point. So don't do that. Use a high spec slippery oil. Something like Tri-Flow would be perfect to drip into those linkages. Now, one other niggle that really sort of annoys me a little bit, but you got to kind of take this one with a pinch of salt. Removing the front wheel is a bit of a pain in the ass. If you're a fan of quick release, this is going to be very annoying for you. Now, it's not a quick release axle. It's just a normal 6mm Allen key to do up the axle, but you have to remove the preload on the spring and set it to maintenance to remove the axle. If you don't take the preload off the spring, then the axle is very, very hard to get out because the spring twists the chassis of the fork a little bit and it doesn't align the left and the right lower leg. So it actually makes it very hard to get the axle in and out unless you take the preload off the spring. Now, the reason this is annoying is you have to turn the Allen key a few times to actually get it into the maintenance mode, and to put it back you have to exactly count how many turns you've undone it to take the axle out. So unless you've got it dialed in and perfect and you undo it exactly 8 turns every time, it's very hard to get the fork back to this setting that you had it set at. So if I'm running 8 turns of preload, I have to put it exactly back to 8. If you forget to count, then your spring's going to be in a different sag range from where you left it or where you had it set from your last ride, which is a little bit annoying. So the shock has a gauge on it, a sag setting gauge. Now that gauge sits a little bit far away from the stanchion, which is where the O-ring sits. That's how you measure your sag. So unless you get your eye exactly right and line it up like this, then it can be a little bit hard to read accurately. I would like to see some markings on the actual stanchion of the shock body as opposed to being outside on the housing. I think that'll be a nice little refinement. So this fork actually has a shock on it. It's actually a pull style shock. What I would like to see with this fork is some independent compression and rebound adjustments. I think that's a must, especially if they're targeting the high-end racer style enduro market. The shock on it now, it works fine for the consumer, but if you're going to be racing or doing some long competitive descents, then you're going to want some independent adjustment. Like I said, it works okay, and how it actually works is you go from the firm trail road mode and then you release the compression. So you're actually undoing the compression on this one adjuster. Once the compression is all the way undone, you continue turning it and then it starts to release the rebound. So this is kind of hard to explain, but you kind of go from the road mode, which is full rebound and full compression, and what you do is you turn it anti-clockwise click by click. So then turning it the first part of the way will open the compression, and then once the compression is fully open, then you can start to open the rebound, but you can't do it independently of each other. Now I would like to add some compression to where I like my rebound set, but that's just me. It works fine, but I find that I would definitely like a little bit more independence in the compression and the rebound settings. So when I get the bike out of the van, I find the suspension to be slightly over damped until it warms up. When it's on the trail, it feels quite nice. If I do an aggressive long enduro sort of a race run, I do find that it tends to heat up a little bit towards the end of the run, and then it becomes a little bit under damped towards the end of the trail. So it is affected by heat, even though they do advertise that this style of shock that they use is not affected by heat. So I definitely would like to see a slightly more sophisticated iteration of this shock, maybe even available as an option. So all in all, can I recommend this fork for purchase? I'm going to say yes, very good. If you're an enduro racer, you might want to have a go on this fork first. And also it has a couple of those little niggles that I mentioned, but they're definitely not deal breakers. The first time you send this fork down a steep section, you're definitely going to be sold, just like I was. So try and find one, have a go on it, and then shut up and take my money time. I hope you enjoyed this review, guys. If I've missed anything or if you've got any questions, pop a comment down below. I will always answer questions down there. If you think I'm a twat, just type twat. Don't forget to like and subscribe this video. Share it with your friends if you thought it was interesting. And as always, right on, guys.